The autumn breeze carried whispers of change through Willow Creek as Zachariah Reed stared out from his weathered porch, his calloused hands gripping the railing like it might anchor him to the past he couldn't seem to escape. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory spread before him like an endless sea of golden grass, beautiful but lonely as the day he'd buried his wife Eleanor 5 years ago. "Pa, you're doing it again," came the voice of his eldest son Thomas, now 22 and bearing the same strong jawline as his father. "Staring off like the mountains might give you answers." "Just thinking," Zachariah muttered, his voice rough from disuse. At 45, he felt ancient, though the town's elders would laugh at such a notion. His dark hair had streaks of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from squinting at the harsh western sun. "About the harvest dance?" asked James, his 19-year-old middle son, stepping out onto the porch with a sly grin. "Miss Winifred Morrison sure has been asking about you." Zachariah felt a twinge of irritation. "I've told you boys, I'm not interested in socializing. The ranch needs work." "The ranch always needs work," countered his youngest, Peter, 18 and full of his mother's spirit. "But we've managed to keep up just fine. And Miss Winifred's apple pies won first prize 3 years running." "I don't care if her pies could make angels sing," Zachariah grumbled, turning back toward the door. "I'm not dancing with anyone." The boys exchanged knowing glances behind their father's back. 5 years was long enough, they had decided. Their mother wouldn't have wanted their father to live like this, a shadow of the man who once laughed and danced under the stars. Across town, Winifred Morrison stood in her small dress shop, pinning the hem of Beatrice Johnson's harvest dance dress. At 38, Winifred had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood, but it didn't stop her from creating beauty for others to wear to celebrations she only observed from the sidelines. "You've outdone yourself, Winnie," Beatrice gushed, twirling carefully. "Charles won't be able to take his eyes off me," Winifred smiled, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "That's the idea," she said warmly. "Every lady deserves to feel beautiful at the harvest dance." "Speaking of which," Beatrice began with a conspiratorial tone, "have you heard, Mrs. Preston is determined to see Zachariah Reed at the dance this year, says it's high time he rejoined the living." Winifred's hands stilled momentarily. She'd seen the tall, broad-shouldered rancher in town occasionally, always serious, always focused on his business. She'd noticed the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to his sons, the gentleness despite his intimidating stature. But she also knew loss had carved deep canyons in his heart, canyons she understood all too well after losing her parents and brother to typhoid years ago. "Mrs. Preston should mind her own affairs," Winifred replied tactfully. "Grief has no timeline." "Perhaps," Beatrice conceded, "but those boys need a mother's touch, and that man needs a woman's love. Everyone in town can see it plain as day." Winifred resumed her work, grateful Beatrice couldn't see the slight flush that had risen to her cheeks. "They're all finished. You'll be the belle of the dance." As Beatrice left, Winifred moved to the shop window, watching the town prepare for the coming festivities. Garlands of autumn leaves hung between buildings, and farmers brought in their harvests with proud smiles. Willow Creek's annual harvest celebration was the highlight of the year, 3 days of feasting, music, and dancing to celebrate the bounty before winter's grip took hold. She wondered, briefly, what it might be like to dance with someone like Zachariah Reed, someone solid and true, whose rough exterior couldn't quite hide the gentle heart beneath. But she quickly dismissed the thought as foolish fancy. Men like him didn't notice women like her. The days passed quickly as the harvest celebration approached. Zachariah worked his ranch harder than necessary, hoping exhaustion would provide an excuse to avoid the festivities altogether. But his sons were craftier than he gave them credit for. "Pa," Thomas said at breakfast on the morning of the dance, "Sheriff Miller stopped by yesterday, says he needs to discuss some cattle rustling concerns with all the ranchers tonight at the dance." Zachariah looked up sharply. "Why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" Thomas shrugged, avoiding his father's eyes. "Forgot, he mentioned it while you were checking the north pasture." "Convenient," Zachariah muttered, but he couldn't ignore the sheriff's summons. Cattle rustlers had been a growing problem in the territory. "Fine. I'll attend the meeting, but I'm not staying for the dance." James and Peter exchanged victorious glances across the table. That evening, Zachariah grudgingly donned his best shirt, a faded blue cotton that Eleanor had once said matched his eyes. He polished his worn boots and trimmed his beard, ignoring the knowing looks from his sons. "You all look too pleased with yourselves," he grumbled as they rode toward town. "Just happy to be celebrating with the community, Pa," Peter said innocently. "It's what Ma would have wanted." The mention of Eleanor sent a familiar pang through Zachariah's chest, but it was duller now, a bruise rather than an open wound. Maybe the boy was right. Eleanor had loved these gatherings, had loved to dance and laugh under the harvest moon. She would have scolded him for becoming so withdrawn. The town square was transformed when they arrived. Lanterns hung from every available post, casting a warm golden glow over the festivities. Tables groaned with food, pies, cakes, roasted meats, and vegetables of every variety. A band played cheerful tunes on a makeshift stage, and couples already swirled across the wooden dance floor that had been constructed especially for the occasion. "I'm going to find Sheriff Miller," Zachariah announced, dismounting from his horse. "We'll stable the horses," Thomas offered quickly. "You go on ahead." Zachariah nodded and made his way through the crowd, tipping his hat to acquaintances but not stopping to chat. He scanned for the sheriff's familiar figure but couldn't spot him among the merrymakers. "Mr. Reed," called a friendly voice. "How wonderful to see you here." He turned to see Mrs. Preston, the town's most determined matchmaker, bearing down on him with a determined smile. "Evening, madam," he said politely, already looking for an escape route. "You must try some of Miss Morrison's apple pie," she insisted, taking his arm and guiding him toward the dessert table. "Absolutely divine. The secret is a hint of nutmeg, or so I've heard." Before Zachariah could protest, he found himself standing before the dessert table where Winifred Morrison was carefully arranging slices of pie on small plates. She looked up at their approach, and their eyes met. Zachariah had seen Miss Morrison around town, of course, but he'd never really looked at her before. Her auburn hair was pinned up with a few rebellious curls framing her face, and her green eyes held a depth of kindness that caught him off guard. She wore a simple dress the color of autumn leaves, and when she smiled hesitantly at him, something long dormant stirred in his chest. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "it's nice to see you at the celebration." "Miss Morrison," he replied with a nod, suddenly aware of his rough appearance compared to the other men in their Sunday best. "I hear your pie is something special." A becoming blush colored her cheeks. "People are too kind, it's just an old family recipe," Mrs. Preston beamed between them. "Winnie, dear, Mr. Reed simply must try a slice, and perhaps you can keep him company while I check on the children's games." Without waiting for a response, she bustled away, leaving them in an awkward silence. Winifred handed him a plate with a generous slice of pie. "Mrs. Preston is nothing if not determined," she said with a small laugh. Zachariah accepted the plate, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "She means well, I suppose. I'm actually looking for Sheriff Miller. Have you seen him?" "He rode out to the Peterson farm about an hour ago," Winifred replied. "One of their hands came to fetch him something about suspicious riders near their property." Zachariah frowned. "Thomas told me the sheriff wanted to meet with the ranchers tonight about rustling concerns." Winifred looked confused. "I haven't heard anything about a meeting." "The sheriff mentioned he'd be back for the dancing later, though." Realization dawned on Zachariah's face, and he glanced across the square where his three sons stood watching him, making no attempt to hide their satisfied grins. "I believe I've been outmaneuvered," he said dryly. Winifred followed his gaze and understood immediately. "Ah, your boys seem to have orchestrated a conspiracy." Her eyes twinkled with amusement. "They must care about you very much." Zachariah sighed, but there was a hint of reluctant humor in his expression. "They're determined to see me rejoin society whether I'm ready or not." "And are you?" she asked gently. "Ready?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. He really looked at her, and saw not pity but understanding in her eyes. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But since I'm here under false pretenses, I might as well try your famous pie." He took a bite and was genuinely surprised by the perfect balance of tart apples, sweet cinnamon, and that hint of nutmeg Mrs. Preston had mentioned. "This is exceptional," he said sincerely. "Thank you," she replied, pleased by his obvious enjoyment. It was my mother's recipe. She always said good food brings people together when words fail. Zachariah nodded, finishing the pie as they stood in companionable silence. The band struck up a lively tune and more couples filled the dance floor. He watched them twirl and laugh, feeling like an observer rather than a participant. "I should probably check on my boys," he said finally. "Make sure they're staying out of trouble." "Of course," Winifred replied with a small smile. "It was nice talking with you, Mr. Reed." He tipped his hat to her and moved away, finding his sons near the cider barrel. "Sheriff Miller called an urgent meeting, did he?" Zachariah asked, crossing his arms and giving them a stern look. Thomas had the grace to look slightly abashed. "We just thought it was time you came to town for something besides supplies and business." "And we were right," James added, not bothering to hide his smile. "You talked to Miss Morrison for nearly 15 minutes. You were counting." Zachariah asked incredulously. Peter grinned. "That's the longest we've seen you talk to any woman since Ma died." Zachariah shook his head. "You boys are impossible. I'm headed home." "What? No," Peter protested. "The dancing's just getting started." "I don't dance," Zachariah said firmly. "Not anymore." Thomas stepped closer, his expression serious now. Ma loved to dance. Remember how she used to say life's too short not to dance when the music plays?" The memory hit Zachariah like a physical blow. Eleanor laughing as he twirled her around their small cabin, her hair flying out behind her like a golden banner. "Some things are too painful to remember, son. And some are too precious to forget," Thomas countered softly. "She wouldn't want this for you, Pa. She wouldn't want you to stop living because she did." The words struck a chord deep within him. Zachariah looked out at the dance floor, at the joy on the faces of his neighbors and friends. Then his eyes found Winifred again, now helping serve coffee at the beverage table. She seemed to sense his gaze and looked up, offering a small, tentative smile before turning back to her task. "1 hour," he conceded finally. "I'll stay for 1 hour, but I'm not dancing." His sons didn't push the issue, clearly considering even this small concession a victory. They dispersed into the crowd, Thomas to chat with the blacksmith's daughter, James to join a group of young men planning a hunting expedition, and Peter to help with the bobbing for apples competition. Zachariah found himself a quiet corner from which to observe the festivities. Despite himself, he found the knot of tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. The music was cheerful, the food delicious, and the company of his community more comforting than he'd expected. He noticed Winifred moving among the townspeople, always with a kind word or helpful hand. She seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere at once, essential to the celebration but somehow separate from it, much like himself, after helping Mrs. Fletcher find her wandering toddler. Winifred approached the refreshment table near where Zachariah stood. She seemed surprised to see him still there. "I thought you might have left," she said, pouring herself a small cup of cider. "I promised my sons an hour," he replied. "It seems the least I could do after their elaborate scheme." She laughed softly, and the sound warmed something in him he'd thought long cold. "They love you," she said. "That's clear to anyone with eyes." "They're good boys," he agreed. "They've had to grow up faster than they should have after their mother passed." Winifred nodded. "Loss shapes us in ways we don't always understand. I was 20 when typhoid took my parents and younger brother in the same terrible week. Sometimes I still turn to tell my mother something before remembering she's gone." Zachariah looked at her with newfound respect. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Morrison. It's not an easy road to walk." "No," she agreed, "but it's a little easier when you don't walk it entirely alone." She gestured to the community around them. "Willow Creek has been my family when I had none left." The band finished a spirited reel and announced they would play a waltz next. Couples began forming on the dance floor, including elderly Mr. and Mrs. Baker, who had been married nearly 50 years. "Would you look at that?" Winifred said with a smile, watching the elderly couple take their positions. "After all these years, they still look at each other like newlyweds." Zachariah followed her gaze, watching the tenderness with which Mr. Baker held his wife's hand. "Eleanor and I used to talk about growing old together like the Bakers," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Winifred turned to him, her eyes gentle. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," Zachariah confirmed, finding it unexpectedly easy to speak of Eleanor with this woman who seemed to understand grief's lingering shadows. Stubborn as the day is long and twice as bright. The music began, a slow, beautiful melody that filled the evening air. Zachariah watched the dancers, feeling a strange mixture of melancholy and something like longing. Across the square, his three sons huddled in urgent conversation, their eyes darting between their father and Winifred. After a moment, Thomas nodded and the three approached with determined expressions. "Pa," Thomas said firmly, "we think it's time you danced." Zachariah shook his head immediately. "I told you boys I don't dance anymore." "Just one dance," James urged. "Ma would want you to." "You used to be the best dancer in the county," Peter added. "Remember how you taught us all to waltz for Aunt Sarah's wedding?" Winifred watched the exchange with quiet interest, clearly not wanting to intrude on the family moment. She began to step away, but Peter quickly turned to her. "Miss Morrison, wouldn't you agree that the harvest celebration isn't complete without everyone participating in at least one dance?" Put on the spot, Winifred's cheeks colored slightly. "Well, I suppose traditions are important," she said diplomatically. "See, Pa," James said triumphantly. "Even Miss Morrison agrees, and she hasn't danced yet either, have you, Miss Morrison?" No," she admitted. Thomas seized the opportunity. "Then it's settled. You two should dance together." "Boys," Zachariah said warningly, but they were undeterred. "Just one dance, Pa," Thomas insisted, his expression earnest. "For Ma." The mention of Eleanor again gave Zachariah pause. Would she truly want this for him? He looked at Winifred, who appeared equally flustered by the boys' matchmaking attempts. "Please don't feel obligated, Mr. Reed," she said quickly. "Your sons are well-meaning but pushy," Zachariah finished for her with a wry smile. "They get that from their mother." The waltz continued to play, the sweet melody tugging at something deep inside him. He looked at his sons' hopeful faces, then back to Winifred's kind eyes. Perhaps it was time to honor Eleanor's memory not by clinging to grief, but by embracing life as she had always done. With a deep breath, Zachariah extended his hand to Winifred. "Miss Morrison, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Surprise and pleasure flashed across her face before she placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted, Mr. Reed." His sons beamed triumphantly as Zachariah led Winifred to the edge of the dance floor. He hesitated just a moment before placing his hand properly at her waist, the other holding hers with care. "I should warn you," he said quietly, "I'm sorely out of practice." "That makes two of us," she replied with a small laugh. "Perhaps we can be clumsy together." With that, he guided her into the waltz, his body remembering the steps despite the years of disuse. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm, but soon began to flow more naturally with the music. Winifred was light in his arms, following his lead with graceful ease that belied her claims of clumsiness. As they circled the dance floor, Zachariah felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, not the weight of grief, which would always be part of him, but the weight of resistance to living fully again. Eleanor had loved to dance, and now he danced in her memory rather than refusing in her name. "You're quite good at this, Mr. Reed," Winifred said, her eyes bright with enjoyment. "Your sons didn't exaggerate." "Zachariah," he corrected her. "If we're dancing together, you might as well use my name." "Zachariah," she repeated softly, "then you must call me Winifred." "Winifred," he echoed, finding he liked the feel of her name on his lips. They continued to dance, gradually moving from the edge to the center of the floor. He became aware of approving glances from townsfolk and his son's undisguised delight, but found he didn't mind. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something like contentment. The music eventually drew to a close, and they stopped dancing, though neither seemed in a hurry to step apart. Finally, Zachariah released her waist but kept hold of her hand. "Thank you for the dance," he said sincerely. "It was more enjoyable than I expected." Her smile brightened her entire face. "The pleasure was mine." They walked together off the dance floor where his sons immediately surrounded them. "That was wonderful, Pa," Peter exclaimed. "You haven't lost your touch," Thomas added with approval. James grinned broadly. "Miss Morrison, you've accomplished what we thought impossible. Our father actually smiled while dancing." Winifred laughed. "Your father is an excellent dancer. I was merely trying not to step on his toes." The evening continued, and to everyone's surprise, especially his own, Zachariah stayed well beyond his promised hour. He danced with Winifred twice more, spoke with neighbors he'd avoided for too long, and even found himself laughing at Sheriff Miller's exaggerated tales when the lawman returned from the Peterson farm. As the celebration wound down near midnight, Zachariah found himself reluctant to leave. His sons had gone their separate ways, Thomas deep in conversation with the blacksmith about improvements to their plow, James helping dismantle one of the game booths, and Peter asleep under a tree after too much cider and excitement. Winifred was gathering her pie plates and baking tins, preparing to return home. Without thinking too much about it, Zachariah approached to help. "Allow me," he said, taking the stack of tins from her arms. "These look unwieldy." "Thank you," she said, gratitude evident in her tired smile. "It's been a long but wonderful day." They walked together through the quieting town square. "May I walk you home?" he asked, surprising himself with the offer. "I'd appreciate that," she replied. "It's not far, just past the church on Maple Street." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the celebration fading behind them. The night air had grown cooler and stars blanketed the clear sky above. "Your sons are remarkable young men," Winifred said eventually. "You should be very proud." "I am," he agreed. "Though after tonight's scheming, I'm not sure whether to be proud or concerned about their manipulative abilities." She laughed softly. "They wanted to see you happy. That seems a worthy cause for a little harmless conspiracy. And were they successful?" He asked, glancing at her profile in the moonlight. She considered this. "Were you happy tonight, Zachariah?" The question gave him pause. "Yes," he said finally, realizing the truth of it. "For the first time in a very long while, I believe I was." They reached her small house, a neat whitewashed building with flower boxes in the windows. A lamp burned low inside, welcoming her home. "This is me," she said unnecessarily, stopping at the gate. He handed her the stack of baking tins, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you for the dances," he said earnestly, "and for the conversation and the pie." She smiled up at him. "Will you be at church tomorrow?" He hesitated. Church was another activity he'd largely abandoned after Eleanor's death. "I hadn't planned on it." "Consider it," she suggested gently. "Reverend Thornton gives a mercifully short sermon, and Mrs. Hamilton brings honey cakes." The invitation was simple, yet it represented something monumental, another step back into the world he'd withdrawn from for so long. "Perhaps I will," he said finally. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this non-committal answer. "Good night, Zachariah." "Good night, Winifred." He waited until she was safely inside before turning back toward the town square to collect his sons and horses for the ride home. As he walked, he found himself humming the waltz they danced to, a melody he hadn't allowed himself to remember for 5 long years. The following morning, to his son's obvious shock, Zachariah announced they would be attending church. They scrambled to don their Sunday clothes, exchanging looks of hopeful disbelief as their father polished his boots and carefully combed his hair. The small church was nearly full when they arrived, but they found space in a pew near the back. Zachariah's eyes automatically sought and found Winifred, sitting midway up the left side. As if sensing his presence, she turned slightly and met his gaze. The smile that illuminated her face made his heart beat a little faster. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside, Zachariah approached her with purpose, ignoring the knowing looks from his sons and several townspeople. "Would you care to join us for Sunday dinner at the ranch?" he asked, the invitation surprising even himself. "It's nothing fancy, but the boys and I would be honored to have you." Winifred's eyes widened slightly. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," he assured her. "In fact, it would be nice to have someone appreciate Thomas's cooking. He's far better at it than I ever was." "In that case," she said with a warm smile, "I would love to." That Sunday dinner became the first of many shared meals. Throughout the autumn, Winifred became a regular visitor to the Reed Ranch, bringing pies and laughter into a home that had known too little of either for too long. Zachariah found himself looking forward to her visits, planning his weekly trips to town around the possibility of seeing her. By the time the first snow fell in December, the entire town was abuzz with speculation about Willow Creek's most unexpected courtship. Zachariah paid the gossip no mind. What existed between him and Winifred was too precious, too carefully nurtured to be reduced to town chatter. On Christmas Eve, with his son's enthusiastic blessing, Zachariah asked Winifred to marry him as they stood on his porch under a sky full of stars. She accepted with tears of joy, and when he kissed her for the first time, he felt the last frozen pieces of his heart finally thaw. They were married in the spring of 1879, when the wildflowers carpeted the prairie and promise hung in the air. The whole town celebrated their union, but none more joyfully than Thomas, James, and Peter, who had orchestrated that first dance with more hope than expectation. As Zachariah and Winifred swayed together for their first dance as husband and wife, he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Thank you for teaching me to dance again." She looked up at him with eyes full of love. "Thank your sons, they knew what you needed before either of us did." He glanced over at the three young men who watched them with undisguised happiness. "They gave me a push," he agreed, "but you gave me a reason to keep dancing." Years passed and the Reed Ranch flourished. Thomas eventually took over most of the operations, allowing Zachariah more time with Winifred and their young daughter, Eleanor Rose, named for two strong women who had shaped their family's story. James became the town's deputy sheriff, and Peter discovered a talent for carpentry, building furniture sought after throughout the territory. Each autumn, without fail, the Reed family attended the harvest celebration. And each year, Zachariah and Winifred danced every dance together, their movements now perfectly in sync from years of practice. Townsfolk would point them out to newcomers, telling the story of the stubborn widower who refused to dance until his sons pushed him toward the woman who would become his second chance at happiness. And every time the music played, Zachariah held his wife close and thanked the stars for sons who knew that sometimes, even the most reluctant heart needs only the right partner to remember the joy of dancing.